Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more.
Several new movies opened this weekend that ended on April 21st, 2024. And 3 of them earned enough revenue to be in this weekend's top 5 movies at the domestic box office. But in reality, it was only a very lackluster weekend overall because the combined domestic box office earnings for the top 5 movies was only $44.7 million, which is less than the $45 million domestic opening weekend box office that Ghostbusters Frozen Empire earned 4 weeks ago. But before proceeding, I'd like to ask everyone to please like this video, please subscribe to this channel, and please press the bell to receive notifications. Thanks! Since 3 movies opened this weekend, that pushed 3 of the movies that I have been tracking below the top 5. So I'll initially cover the top 8 movies for this weekend's box office recap. Clinging to the number 1 spot this weekend was Alex Garland's dystopian action movie Civil War that has a moderately high production budget of $50 million. Domestically, the movie earned another $11.1 million to bring its current domestic box office total up to $44.9 million. Last week, the movie had not earned any reportable international box office, but it did as of this weekend. And as I had suspected in my video that I had released for last weekend's box office roundup, the movie indeed only has very limited appeal outside of the US due to it being such a US-centric movie. So much so that Civil War has only earned a very pathetic $3.3 million internationally to give the movie a current global gross box office total of $48.2 million. And no, I don't expect this movie to break even, as I'll talk about in more detail shortly. Opening in the second position in this weekend's domestic box office is the horror movie Abigail, which has a moderately sized production budget of $28 million. The movie earned $10.2 million domestically and $5 million internationally to give the movie a global gross opening weekend box office of $15.2 million. When I multiply the movie's $28 million production budget by 2.5 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget, we get an estimated mid-range break-even point of $70 million. So unless this movie can start to bring in a lot more international box office, I don't expect it to break even, but I'm also not going to closely track it as it will likely quickly drop out of the top 5 domestic box office movies after this week. Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire fell to the number 3 position in this weekend's domestic box office by earning another $9.5 million to bring its current domestic box office total up to $171.6 million. Internationally, the movie earned another $35 million to bring its current international box office total up to $313.6 million. So globally, the movie earned another $48.7 million to bring its current global gross box office total up to $485.2 million, which is adding more money to the movie's profits. Opening in 4th place this weekend is the action comedy war movie The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, produced by Guy Ritchie and starring Henry Cavill. Based on the 2014 non-fiction historical book entitled Churchill's Secret Warriors: The Explosive True Story of the Special Forces Desperados of World War II by Damian Lewis, the film portrays a heavily fictionalized version of Operation Postmaster as described in the book. And guess what? By making light of an actual battle and what those who went through it endured, unsurprisingly, this movie is not gaining much of an audience as revealed by its $9 million domestic opening weekend box office for a film that has a $60 million production budget. Further, movies set in that time period from 1933 to 1945 and are focused on the political party that ruled Germany during that time, I find it very unlikely that younger millennials, as well as members of Generation Y and Generation Z, will be drawn to such movies because that period and those events correspond more to their grandparents' time, which makes it far less relatable to themselves, and they are the people who are far more likely to want to go to the movie theater. And further complicating the movie's potential earnings, as reported by Variety Today, Lionsgate, the film's distributor, only obtained US rights to the film, so Amazon Prime will be releasing it in much of the rest of the world. Thus, there won't be much, if any, international box office for the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, so it will most definitely be a box office flop. And since streaming services don't reveal how much money individual streamed films like this earn, presumably by the number of viewed minutes, there's no way to ascertain what the movie's earnings will actually be. Opening domestically in 5th place this weekend was the 2023 Japanese animated movie Spy X Family Code White. Distributed by Crunchyroll, the movie earned $4.9 million domestically, but since it opened in Japan back in December of 2023, its international box office earnings are already over $40 million. So the movie's current global gross box office earnings are $44.9 million. In 6th place domestically this weekend was Kung Fu Panda 4, which earned another $4.6 million to bring its current domestic box office total up to $180 million, which allows it to remain as the second highest grossing movie domestically for 2024 to date, behind Dune Part 2. Internationally, the movie earned another $21.4 million to bring its current international box office total up to $300.3 million. So globally, the movie earned another $27.7 million to bring its current global gross box office total up to $480.3 million. Remaining in 7th place domestically this weekend was Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, which earned another $4.4 million to bring its current domestic box office total up to $102.9 million. Internationally, the movie earned another $10.2 million to bring its current international box office total up to $73.2 million. So globally, the movie earned another $16.1 million to bring its current global gross box office total up to $176.1 million. And finally, in 8th place domestically this weekend was Dune Part 2, which earned another $2.9 million to bring its current domestic box office total up to $276.6 million, which maintains the movie as the highest grossing movie domestically of 2024 to date. Internationally, the movie earned another $7.4 million to bring its current international box office total up to $419.2 million. So globally, the movie earned another $11.9 million to bring its current global gross box office total up to $695.8 million, which maintains Dune Part 2 as the highest grossing movie worldwide for 2024 to date. Now going back to Civil War, with a $50 million production budget, when multiplied by 2.5 and 3.0 respectively, we get an estimated break-even point ranging from $125 million to $150 million. Using a range of possible average weekly drops from 30 to 40%, I can project that this movie's final domestic box office may range from $73.6 million at the low end, $80.5 million at the mid-range, and $89.5 million at the upper end. As I said earlier in the video, and in the one that I released last week, given that there aren't that many foreign countries listed where Civil War is supposed to be released, and there appears to be very little interest in the movie outside of the US so far, the movie currently has a domestic share of 93.12%. So the projected final global gross box office for the movie isn't much better than the final domestic box office projections: $79.1 million at the low end, $86.4 million at the mid-range, and $96.1 million at the upper end. And that range is far below what's needed for the movie to break even. So unless the movie can obtain a lot more interest and revenue internationally, Civil War is going to flop. Going back to Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire, it reportedly had a production budget of $135 million, which, when we multiply by 2.5 and 3.0 respectively, we get an estimated break-even point ranging from $337.5 million to $405 million. So to project what the final domestic box office for Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire might be, I'll use a range of average weekly drops that are based on one standard deviation above and below the overall average weekly drop for the past 4 Warner Bros. Godzilla movies, which is 39.47%. And with a standard deviation of 6.58%, that creates a range from 32.89% to 46.05%. Using that range, I can project that the final domestic box office for Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire may range from $187.5 million at the low end, $192.4 million at the mid-range, and $199.2 million at the upper end, which is more narrow than last week's projected range. To project what this movie's final global gross box office might be, I'll use the movie's current domestic share of 35.37%, which is slightly lower than last weekend's domestic share and is within one standard deviation of the previous four movies' average domestic share of 29.57%. So using the movie's current domestic share of 35.37%, I can project that the movie's final global gross box office may range from $530.2 million at the low end, $544.1 million at the mid-range, and $563.3 million at the upper end, which is also a more narrow range than last week's projections. Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire, like Dune Part 2 and Kung Fu Panda 4, has already broken even, so all of the additional money it's currently earning is counting towards its profitability. Going back to Kung Fu Panda 4, this is the fourth movie in a franchise that has a franchise average weekly drop of only 28.52%, which is somewhat low, and its standard deviation is only 0.49%, which is incredibly low. In order to project how well Kung Fu Panda 4 might do domestically, I decided to multiply that standard deviation by 10 so that I could create a broader possible range of average weekly drops from 23.66% to 33.38%. And using that range, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for Kung Fu Panda 4 may range from $192.3 million at the low end, $195.3 million at the mid-range, and $199.1 million at the upper end, which is slightly higher and more narrow than last week's projected range. And the movie's domestic share did slightly drop again to 37.47%, so I can project that the movie's final global gross box office will probably range from $513.3 million at the low end, $521.1 million at the mid-range, and $531.4 million at the upper end, which is also a slightly higher but more narrow projection than last week. Given that Kung Fu Panda 4 has a production budget of only $85 million, when multiplied by 2.5, we get an estimated mid-range break-even point of only $212.5 million. Thus, like Dune Part 2 and Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire, Kung Fu Panda 4 has already broken even and made bank. Now going back to Ghostbusters: Frozen Empire, this is the fifth movie within the Ghostbusters franchise, which began in 1984. With a production budget that's only $100 million, when multiplied by 2.5 and 3.0 respectively, we get an estimated break-even point ranging from $250 million to $300 million. As I had explained in last week's box office roundup video, while there are four previous Ghostbusters movies, the first one has such a low average weekly drop that it artificially lowers the franchise average weekly drop too much and also creates too large of a standard deviation to be useful. So instead, I'm using the past three Ghostbusters movies to create an adjusted franchise average weekly drop of 32.02% and a corresponding standard deviation of only 5.13%, which gives me a range of possible average weekly drops from 26.9% to 37.15%, which is a very reasonable range. And using that range in conjunction with the current domestic box office earnings for Ghostbusters: Frozen Empire, I can project that its final domestic box office earnings may range from $113 million at the low end, $115.5 million at the mid-range, and $118.9 million at the upper end, which is only slightly more narrow overall than last week's projection. The movie's current domestic share dropped again to 58.44% from last week's 60.62%, which places it even further below the franchise's average domestic share of 63.46%. And when I use the movie's current domestic share of 58.44%, I can project that the final global gross box office for the movie may range from $193.4 million at the low end, $197.7 million at the mid-range, and $203.5 million at the upper end, which is a slightly higher and more narrow range than last week's projection. Thus, Ghostbusters Frozen Empire is a flop and will most likely lose as much as $46.5 million to $106.6 million in global gross box office revenue, which, when divided by 2 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, means that the production companies behind it, which includes Sony and Columbia Pictures, currently stand to lose anywhere from $23.3 million to $53.3 million. And finally, going back to Dune Part 2, which is the last movie that I'll be talking about in this video, using the same range of possible average weekly drops from 32.86% to 42.86%, as I had used in previous week's projections, my revised projections for the movie's final domestic box office earnings now range from $282.5 million at the low end, $283.9 million at the mid-range, and $285.6 million at the upper end, which is a very similar but more narrow range than last week's projected range. The movie's domestic share is nearly the same as last week's at 39.75%, which I can use to project that the movie's final global gross box office revenue will probably range from $710.7 million at the low end, $714.1 million at the mid-range, and $718.4 million at the upper end, which is a slightly more narrow range than last week's projections. Dune Part 2 should break $700 million globally by next weekend. Given that Dune Part 2 has an estimated break-even point ranging from $475 million to $570 million, which is calculated by multiplying its $190 million production budget by 2.5 and 3.0 respectively, the movie has already made bank. Thus, while Ghostbusters Frozen Empire is a definite flop and Civil War is a likely flop, it looks like they are now being joined in the flop column by Abigail and the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. But Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire, Dune Part 2, and Kung Fu Panda 4 are all profitable. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.